Medieval peasants survived blizzards, plagues, and famines with zero modern technology. Yet most of us can't handle a camping trip without panic. What did they know about outdoor survival that we've completely forgotten? Tonight, you'll discover why their primitive methods might actually save your life. Your fancy butane lighter just died in the middle of nowhere. Again. Meanwhile, medieval folks were making fire with flint and steel for over 1,000 years without a single warranty claim. Here's the thing about flint and steel that modern campers miss. It works when everything else fails. Rain? No problem. Your steel striker hits that chunk of flint and sparks fly like tiny fireworks. Those sparks burn at around 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to make your neighbor's barbecue jealous. But here's where it gets interesting. You need tinder that catches easier than gossip in a small town. Charcloth works best. It's cotton fabric that's been partially burned until it's black and crumbly. One spark hits that charcloth, and you've got a glowing ember ready to birth a proper fire. The trick is in the angle. Strike down at about 45 degrees, like you're trying to shave metal curls off your striker. Those sparks need to land right on your tinder bundle. Then blow gently, not like you're inflating a pool float, but like you're coaxing a shy cat. Makes sense, right? Well, once you've mastered fire, your medieval ancestors had another clever trick for turning that flame into a proper outdoor kitchen. Your flint and steel might get you fire, but what happens when you need to cook an actual meal? Enter the Dutch oven, medieval Europe's answer to, "I'm tired of burnt rabbit on a stick." This cast iron beast weighs more than a suit of armor. But here's the thing. It'll outlast your great-grandchildren. Medieval cooks figured out something we're still trying to master today. Heat retention. The thick walls store thermal energy like a battery, cooking food evenly without constant fussing. You can roast, bake, stew, or even fry in this thing. Toss some coals underneath, pile more on the lid, and suddenly you've got an oven that would make a monastery kitchen jealous. The best part? It actually improves with age, developing a natural non-stick surface that modern cookware manufacturers spend millions trying to replicate. My grandfather used to say his Dutch oven cooked better than his wife, though never when she was listening. But seriously, the flavor development in cast iron is unmatched. Something about the iron leaching into acidic foods creates depth you simply can't get elsewhere. Well, cooking's only half the battle when you're roughing it outdoors. What about when that creek water looks questionable? Medieval folks didn't have fancy water bottles with built-in filters, but they weren't drinking muddy pond water either. They knew something we're just rediscovering. Nature makes an excellent water purification system. Here's the beauty of it. You take a container, punch holes in the bottom, then layer your materials like you're building a geological sandwich. Coarse gravel goes first. Think pebbles about the size of your thumbnail. Then comes sand, preferably the fine stuff that gets between your toes at the beach. Finally, charcoal from your campfire, crushed into chunks. But here's where it gets interesting. The charcoal isn't just sitting there looking pretty, it's actually grabbing onto nasty chemicals and pulling them out of the water. Medieval blacksmiths figured this out centuries before we understood the science behind it. Now, don't expect this thing to work like a high-tech camping filter on steroids. It removes sediment, some bacteria, and makes water taste less like a swamp. You'll still want to boil questionable water afterward, because medieval folks weren't immune to waterborne illnesses either. The whole setup takes about 30 minutes to build, assuming you're not all thumbs. Speaking of time, there's another medieval trick that'll help you track it without checking your phone every 5 minutes. Medieval folks didn't have grocery stores, but they had something better. Nature's pharmacy and pantry rolled into one. Your great-great-grandmother probably knew which weeds could cure a headache and which berries wouldn't send her to meet her maker. Let's start with the obvious winners. Dandelions aren't just lawn pests your neighbor obsesses over. Every part is edible. Leaves make a bitter salad that's loaded with vitamins. Roots can be roasted for coffee that won't keep you up all night complaining about your back. Then there's plantain, nicknamed Nature's Band-Aid, by medieval herbalists who clearly had better marketing skills than today's pharmaceutical companies. You've probably stepped on it 1,000 times without realizing it's basically edible first aid. Wild garlic smells like your Italian grandmother's kitchen and tastes even better. Medieval monks grew it in monastery gardens because they weren't fools. But here's the thing that'll save your life. The universal edibility test. Rub the plant on your skin first. Wait 15 minutes. Touch it to your lips, then tongue, then chew without swallowing. Each step gets a 15-minute timeout. However, knowing what not to eat might be even more crucial when you're miles from civilization. You know what's funny about modern camping gear? We spend hundreds of dollars on lightweight tents that can barely handle a stiff breeze. Meanwhile, medieval travelers built shelters from literal trash that could keep them alive in a blizzard. The debris hut is basically nature's sleeping bag. Start by finding a long ridgepole. Think the spine of your shelter. Prop one end against a tree about 3 feet high, anchor the other on the ground. Now comes the fun part that'll make you feel like a giant beaver. Lean shorter sticks against both sides of your ridgepole, creating a skeleton frame. The angle matters here. Too steep and you'll freeze. Too flat and rain becomes your unwelcome bunkmate. Aim for about 45 degrees. Here's where it gets interesting. Pile on the debris. Leaves, pine needles, bark, moss, whatever Mother Nature swept under her rug. You need at least 2 feet of insulation all around. Sounds excessive? Well, medieval folks didn't have the luxury of complaining about being too warm. The secret sauce is creating an interior just big enough for your body. Bigger means colder, and nobody wants to shiver like a chihuahua all night. But what happens when you need actual fire inside your shelter? A bow drill turns wood into fire through pure friction. No matches, no lighter fluid, just you, some sticks, and enough arm strength to make a caveman proud. Here's the deal. You need 4 pieces: a fireboard, a spindle, a bow, and a handhold. The fireboard gets a small notch carved into it where the spindle sits. Your spindle should be straight as your grandfather's backbone and about as thick as your thumb. The bow part? Any flexible branch will do. String it up with cordage. Shoelaces work in a pinch, though medieval folks use plant fibers or sinew. Wrap the string once around your spindle, place the spindle in the fireboard notch, and start sawing back and forth like you're playing the world's most important violin. The friction creates wood dust that gets hotter and hotter. Keep going until you see smoke, then keep going some more. Your arms will burn, but that's nothing compared to freezing to death. When the dust finally glows red, you've got an ember. Gently transfer it to your tinder bundle and blow softly. Too hard and you'll kill it faster than a bad joke at dinner. But what happens when you need rope to make that bow? Plant fibers hold secrets most people never discover. You know that moment when your shoelace snaps right before a big hike? Medieval folks didn't have the luxury of running to the nearest sporting goods store. They made their own rope from whatever grew around them. Nettle stems work brilliantly for this. Yeah, the same plant that stings like your mother-in-law's criticism. But here's the trick. After the first frost kills the sting, those fibrous stems become cordage gold. Strip the outer layer, and you'll find long, strong fibers inside. The process is surprisingly simple. Take individual fibers and twist them together while adding new ones as you go. It's like braiding hair, except your grandmother probably never taught you this version. Keep twisting in the same direction. Clockwise works best for most people. Basswood bark is another winner. Native Americans called it the rope tree for good reason. One mature basswood can provide enough cordage to tie down a small village. Well, maybe not a whole village, but you get the idea. The key is keeping steady tension while you twist. Too loose and it falls apart. Too tight and it becomes brittle as old bones. But what happens when you need something even stronger than plant fibers for your outdoor adventures? Medieval monasteries weren't just centers of prayer. They were the original pharmacies. Those hooded folks knew their plants better than your neighborhood CVS knows its shelves. They had to. When the nearest doctor was 3 kingdoms away and riding a donkey, you learned which leaves stopped bleeding and which ones made your tooth stop throbbing. Let's start with the basics. Your great-great-grandmother would have known by heart. Willow bark contains the same active ingredient as aspirin. Chew it for headaches or joint pain. But here's the kicker. It tastes like you're munching on a tree branch soaked in bitterness. Makes you appreciate those little white pills, doesn't it? Plantain leaves are nature's band-aids. Crush them up and slap them on cuts or insect bites. They reduce swelling and help wounds heal faster. Medieval soldiers called it soldier's herb for good reason. These guys were getting sliced and diced regularly. They needed something that worked. Then there's echinacea for boosting immunity when you feel that scratchy throat coming on. Native Americans used it for centuries before Europeans caught on. The purple flowers are your clue. But here's where things get tricky, and why knowing your navigation becomes absolutely crucial when you're searching for these healing plants in the wild. Before GPS turned us into navigation zombies, medieval travelers had something we've almost forgotten: the ability to read the sky like a roadmap. And honestly, they were pretty darn good at it. The sun becomes your most reliable compass when you know the basics. It rises in the east, sets in the west, and at midday sits roughly south if you're in the northern hemisphere. Simple stuff, right? But here's where it gets interesting. You can tell time within about 30 minutes just by watching shadows. Medieval merchants crossing continents didn't carry pocket sundials for decoration. They used shadow sticks, planting a straight branch in the ground and marking shadow tips every hour. The shortest shadow? That's your true north-south line. Then there's nighttime navigation, which is where things get really cool. The North Star hasn't moved much in 1,000 years, making it the ultimate fixed reference point. Find the Big Dipper, draw an imaginary line through the 2 stars at the end of the cup, and extend it about 5 times that distance. Boom. North Star. Even when clouds roll in, these celestial techniques keep working better than a dead phone battery. Speaking of reliable outdoor skills, let's talk about something that'll actually put food on your camp table. Fish have been outsmarting humans for centuries, but medieval folks figured out something we've forgotten. They built traps that worked while they slept. Genius, right? Here's the thing about emergency fish traps. They're basically underwater jail cells with terrible security. You want fish to check in, but never check out. Start with a funnel shape using flexible branches or even large leaves if you're desperate. The wide opening lures them in, but the narrow exit, that's where their vacation ends. Position your trap in shallow water where fish naturally travel. Think of it as setting up a roadblock on the fish highway. Medieval monks were masters at this. They'd place traps near stream bends where currents naturally push fish along. Smart cookies, those monks. The beauty is you don't need bait. Fish are naturally curious creatures like cats, but wetter. They'll swim into anything that looks interesting. Use rocks to weigh down your trap and create a natural-looking obstruction. Well, here's the kicker. Patience beats fancy gear every time. Check your trap every few hours, not every few minutes. Fish aren't stupid. They'll avoid areas with too much human activity. But what happens when you need to send an SOS signal that travels for miles? When you're lost in the wilderness and your cell phone shows 0 bars, medieval folks had their own version of calling for help. They'd grab some green branches and create smoke signals that could be seen for miles. Here's the thing about smoke signals. They're basically nature's flare gun, except they don't expire after 5 years sitting in your glove compartment. You need 3 key ingredients: a good fire base, green vegetation, and clear weather conditions. Start your fire with dry wood to get a solid flame going. Then comes the magic part. Pile on fresh green boughs, wet leaves, or even damp grass. The moisture creates thick white smoke that billows up like a chimney. But here's what separates the pros from the amateurs. Timing matters more than your mother-in-law's dinner invitations. Create the signal in 3 distinct puffs by covering and uncovering your fire with a blanket or large piece of bark. 3 of anything is the universal distress signal, works better than semaphore flags, and doesn't require you to remember those confusing hand positions. The Greeks used this system to communicate across mountain ranges during wartime. Pretty impressive for folks who thought the earth was flat, right? Now, speaking of medieval ingenuity, what happens when your gear breaks down completely? Medieval craftsmen knew something we've forgotten in our plastic world. When your bow snapped or your tool handle cracked, you couldn't just order a replacement on Amazon. You made glue, real glue, the kind that actually worked. Start with animal hooves if you can find them. Old horse hooves work best. Boil them down until they turn into a thick, gooey mess. Sounds gross? Well, your great-grandfather probably fixed half his farm equipment with this stuff. No joke, hide glue was stronger than most modern adhesives. But here's the kicker. Tree sap works too. Pine resin mixed with a little charcoal powder creates an adhesive that'll hold through rain, snow, and your neighbor's terrible camping stories. Heat it gently. Don't let it bubble like a witch's cauldron. The beauty? This glue stays workable when warm, hardens when cool. Medieval archers used it to attach fletching to arrows. Knights used it for weapon repairs. Makes sense, right? I fixed broken tent poles, cracked paddle handles, even a friend's expensive fishing rod with pine sap glue. Cost me nothing but 20 minutes by the fire. Now, speaking of getting creative with nature's materials, wait until you see what flexible branches can do for your dinner plans. Forget expensive fishing nets when you can weave your own fish basket from whatever's growing nearby. Medieval fishermen mastered this trick centuries before Bass Pro Shops existed. And honestly, their method might catch more fish than your fancy gear. You'll need flexible branches. Willow works best, but any bendy wood will do. Start by creating a cone shape, like making the world's most productive dunce cap. Weave horizontal strips through the vertical framework, keeping gaps small enough that fish can't slip through sideways. Here's the clever part. Leave the narrow end slightly open. Fish swim in easily, but can't figure out how to reverse their way out. It's like a roach motel, but for dinner instead of pest control. Medieval monks used these baskets to stock their Friday fish requirements without breaking a sweat. Smart guys. They understood that working harder isn't always working smarter. The beauty lies in the simplicity. No hooks, no bait, no standing around holding a rod like you're waiting for divine intervention. Just set it in shallow water near rocks or fallen logs where fish like to hide. But even the best fish trap won't help if you can't preserve your catch once you've got it. Your ancestors knew something we've forgotten about keeping food fresh without fridges. Medieval monks and farmers turned spoilage into an art form, literally fermenting their way through harsh winters when fresh produce was just a distant memory. Here's the kicker. Fermentation doesn't just preserve food, it actually makes it more nutritious. Those bacteria working overtime create vitamins your body craves. It's like having a chemistry lab in a jar, except this one won't blow up your kitchen. The process is surprisingly simple. Salt becomes your best friend here. Pack vegetables with salt, weigh them down, and let nature do the heavy lifting. The good bacteria crowd out the bad ones faster than teenagers clearing out a pizza buffet. But here's where it gets interesting. You can ferment almost anything. Cabbage becomes sauerkraut, cucumbers turn into pickles, and even fish can get the fermentation treatment if you're feeling adventurous. Medieval folks weren't picky about their preservation methods. The beauty lies in the timing. 3 days to 2 weeks, depending on what you're fermenting and how patient you feel. Temperature matters too. Think cool basement, not tropical vacation. Now, speaking of keeping things intact during your outdoor adventures, what happens when your gear starts falling apart? Your grandfather probably had better sewing skills than most people today. Back when medieval folks couldn't just pop into a store for new clothes, hand sewing wasn't a hobby, it was survival. One torn cloak in winter could literally mean the difference between life and death. Here's the thing about medieval stitching that modern people miss. They didn't just slap fabric together. These folks developed techniques that made their repair stronger than the original material. The running stitch, backstitch, and blanket stitch weren't fancy names. They were tools that kept families warm. But here's where it gets interesting. Medieval seamsters used sinew from animals instead of thread when they needed maximum strength. Talk about using every part of the buffalo. This natural thread could hold through storms that would snap modern synthetic materials. The secret was in their needle technique. They'd punch holes with an awl first, then follow with the needle. Less tearing, stronger seams makes sense, right? Learning to sew by hand isn't just about fixing torn gear outdoors. It's about developing patience and precision that our ancestors knew by heart. Your fingers become your tools, and every stitch becomes a small victory against the elements. Speaking of natural materials, though, those medieval hunters had another trick up their sleeves. Here's the thing about medieval hunters. They weren't running around with crossbows all day like some fantasy movie. Most of their protein came from small game caught in cleverly placed snares. Smart, right? A basic snare works on simple physics. You create a noose from cordage, position it along an animal trail, and attach it to a bent sapling or weighted trigger. When a rabbit or squirrel steps through, the loop tightens and, well, dinner is served. The beauty lies in the setup. Look for natural funnels where animals must squeeze through, between rocks, under fallen logs, or along stream banks. Animals are creatures of habit, much like my neighbor Bob, who takes the exact same walking route every morning at 7:15. Medieval poachers perfected this art out of necessity. Getting caught hunting deer on noble land meant losing a hand. But nobody cared about a few rabbits disappearing into peasant stew pots. The trigger mechanism matters most. Too sensitive, and you'll catch every curious chipmunk. Too loose, and your target walks right through. Practice makes perfect, though patience runs thin when your stomach's growling. But what happens when you need to preserve that fresh meat for weeks without refrigeration? Medieval dyers had something we've completely forgotten. They knew how to turn weeds into wearable art. Those vibrant tapestries hanging in castles, not a drop of synthetic color in sight. Here's the kicker. Your backyard is probably loaded with natural dye materials. Red cabbage gives you purple that would make royalty jealous. Onion skins, golden yellow that beats any store-bought fabric dye. Even coffee grounds can turn your torn camping shirt into something that looks intentionally rugged. The process is dead simple. Chop up your plant material, boil it in water for about 30 minutes, then strain out the chunks. Well, that's your dye bath ready to go. But here's where medieval folks were clever. They used mordants. Fancy word for stuff that makes colors stick permanently. Salt works for most dyes, vinegar for others. Without it, your beautiful new color washes out faster than a politician's promise. The weird part is how therapeutic this becomes. There's something oddly satisfying about creating your own colors from scratch. Makes you feel like you're tapping into centuries of human creativity. Speaking of human needs, medieval folks also figured out how to harvest one of life's most essential minerals straight from the ocean itself. Ever wondered why wars were fought over tiny white crystals? Salt wasn't just seasoning back then, it was liquid gold, literally worth its weight in precious metals. Medieval folks called it white gold for good reason. Here's the kicker. You can make your own salt using nothing but seawater and sunshine. Sounds too simple? Well, it fooled empires into building entire economies around it. Find a shallow container, anything flat works. Pour seawater into it about an inch deep. Now comes the hard part, waiting. The sun does all the heavy lifting while you twiddle your thumbs like a medieval salt baron. As water evaporates, those precious crystals start appearing. It's like watching money grow, except crunchier. Takes about a week in decent weather, longer if Mother Nature's feeling moody. But here's what nobody tells you. The first batch tastes terrible, full of sand and sea crud. Medieval salt makers knew the secret. Filter through cloth first, then evaporate. Makes all the difference between gourmet seasoning and sandy disappointment. 1 gallon of seawater gives you roughly 4 tablespoons of salt. Not much, but enough to preserve meat for weeks. Speaking of preservation, those same medieval masters discovered another trick that modern gardeners swear by. Your grandmother probably knew something NASA scientists are just catching up to. Medieval farmers didn't have fancy fertilizers or growth hormones, yet they consistently produced better yields than many modern organic farms. Their secret weapon? The moon. Sounds like witchcraft, right? Well, it's actually solid science wrapped in centuries of observation. Medieval farmers noticed that seeds planted during certain moon phases grew stronger, produced more fruit, and resisted pests better. They didn't understand gravitational pull or electromagnetic fields. They just knew it worked. Here's the basic system. Plant leafy greens during the waxing moon when energy flows upward. Root vegetables go in during the waning moon when energy pulls downward. It's like giving your plants a cosmic energy drink at exactly the right moment. The moon controls ocean tides, so why wouldn't it affect the water in soil and plants? Medieval farmers were essentially surfing lunar waves for better harvests. They'd plant beans and peas right after the new moon, watching them sprout like clockwork. But here's where it gets really interesting. They also timed their harvesting by moon phases. Herbs picked during a full moon supposedly contained more potent oils and flavors. Speaking of timing, medieval hunters had their own celestial secrets for tracking prey through the wilderness. Ever notice how your grandfather could spot a deer trail from 50 yards away while you can barely find your car keys? Medieval hunters didn't have the luxury of GPS or trail cameras. They survived by reading nature's newspaper, animal tracks. Here's the thing about tracking. It's like being a detective, except your suspect left muddy footprints instead of fingerprints. Fresh tracks have sharp edges and clear toe marks. Old ones? They look like your face after a long weekend, worn out and blurry. Start with the basics. Deer tracks look like upside-down hearts, while rabbit prints resemble tiny hands. Turkey tracks? They're basically dinosaur feet, which makes sense since they practically are dinosaurs with attitude problems. But tracking isn't just about footprints. Look for bent grass, scratched bark, and yes, animal droppings. Medieval hunters called it sign reading, though they probably had more colorful terms after stepping in it. The real secret? Follow water sources. Animals need to drink, just like your uncle needs his morning coffee. Set up near streams or ponds, and you're basically running a wildlife highway patrol. Practice this skill, and you'll understand why our ancestors never went hungry. Well, except during those awkward plague years.